Mrs Pepperpot Turns Detective by Alf Proysen. Mrs Pepperpot has tried her hand at many jobs, but this autumn she's tried something new. She has turned detective. Of all the seasons, Mrs Pepperpot likes autumn best. When anyone complains that it's dark and dreary, she always answers that it's the best time of the year, because then we get the reward for all the hard work we put in the spring, with our digging and sowing and planting. But the days get so short and the nights get so long, they say. That makes it all the cosier indoors, says Mrs Pepperpot. And think of all the fun the children have, playing detectives with torches in the dark. All right, but what about the burglars and such like? They have a much better chance to do their stealing at this time of the year. So the argument ran, but Mrs Pepperpot said no more, because, you see, someone had been stealing from her, and she'd very much wanted to play detective herself. And what do you think was being stolen from Mrs Pepperpot? Her potatoes, of all things. Ever since September, when she first started digging them up, she had been finding plants with no potatoes under them. They had been dug up, the potatoes taken off, and then the plants stuck back in the soil to make them look as if they were still growing. Oh, what a cunning trick! Mrs Pepperpot couldn't think who it could be. If only she were a real detective, then she could trace footprints in the mud, perhaps even fingerprints on the leaves of the potato plants. She could build a secret observation post and carry a gun, and when she'd caught the thief red-handed, she would say, "Hands up!" At supper one night, she was thinking so hard about being a detective that she said, "Hands up," when she was passing a bowl of hot stew to her husband, and he dropped it all over the clean tablecloth in fright. For once, she couldn't very well scold him. After supper, she remembered she'd left her potato bucket out in the field almost full of potatoes. I'd better fetch it in, or the thief might take that too, she thought. She put a scarf round her head and found the torch, for it was a very dark night. Then she went out to the field and was just bending down to pick up the bucket when she heard someone climbing through the hedge. Quickly, she put out the torch and got right down on her knees over the bucket so that she couldn't be seen. "I'll catch 'em this time," she said to herself, and her heart was going pitter-pat with excitement. But was she cross a moment later, when she found herself sprawling amongst the potatoes inside the bucket? She had shrunk, of course. It wasn't even any good trying to climb out of the bucket, because how could she get through all that mud back to the house while she was so tiny? And she did so want to catch the thief. So there was nothing for it but to lie where she was and try and see what the thief looked like. First she listened very carefully. There was someone climbing through the hedge. Right enough. But what was that? 2 more people seemed to be coming through, and they were not being very quiet about it either. Now she could hear them whispering to each other. "Mind how you go." This was a boy's voice. "I had to pull him through the hedge," answered a girl's voice. "She hurt me," wailed another younger voice. "Shh," whispered the big boy, "or we'll go straight home and not get any potatoes tonight." Mrs Pepperpot could hear them coming down one of the rows with a spade. They also had a bucket which rattled. The steps stopped. Now she could hear the spade going into the soil. "Look, sis," said the big boy's voice. "These are whopping great potatoes. Hold the bucket." The smaller child's footsteps started coming in Mrs Pepperpot's direction, and in another moment he had found her bucket. "Come here, "Come here," he called in a high baby voice, quite forgetting he'd promised to keep quiet. "What is it?" hissed the boy. "Don't shout." But the little boy went on. "Lots of potatoes in a bucket," he announced. "I'll give you lots of potatoes in a bucket," muttered Mrs Pepperpot to herself. "I'll have you all three arrested when I get back to my proper size." Then, as quietly as she could, she worked her way down under the top layer of potatoes so that the children wouldn't see her. It was only just in time, as the big boy and the girl came over to have a look, and they were so pleased with little brother's find that the big boy lifted up the bucket and made for the hedge. "You carry the other bucket," whispered the big boy to the little one. "It's not so heavy." I dood," piped the little fellow, who couldn't say his K's and G's. "I find lots of potatoes." And he scrambled after the others, dragging the lighter bucket after him. "It's a good thing it's so dark," said the big boy as they all got through the hedge onto the path. "No one can see us here." The little girl shivered a little. "I feel like a real burglar in a detective story," she said. "Ah, burgle, burgle," chimed in the little one. "Burglars don't usually carry detectives around in buckets," said Mrs Pepperpot to herself. "Just you wait, my fine friends." At last the children stopped at a door. They knocked and called, "Open the door, Mother, and see what we've brought." The door opened and Mrs Pepperpot heard a woman's voice say, "My, that's a fine bucketful. It'll keep us well fed for days. I'll heat the water in the pot straight away." "I has some too," shouted the youngest, showing her the big potatoes in his buckets. "2 buckets. That means you've taken one that doesn't belong to us. One of you'll have to take it back when you've eaten." "But, Mother," said the boy. "There's no but about it," said his mother firmly. "We may be so poor we have to help ourselves to a few potatoes now and then, but I hope to make it up to the owner of that field before too long. The bucket goes straight back." Mrs Pepperpot could hardly believe her ears. Here was a family right on her doorstep, so to speak, and she didn't know they were going hungry. They must be new to the neighbourhood, or surely someone would have helped them. Well, she would certainly let them have whatever potatoes they needed, no doubt about that. She'd almost forgotten she was being a detective, and a doll-sized one at that, when the mother started lifting the potatoes out of the bucket to put them in the saucepan, which was now bubbling on the stove. Poor Mrs Pepperpot, what should she do? "A fine thing," she said to herself, burrowing deeper and deeper into the bucket to hide herself. "Here I am being sorry for them, because they're poor, when I ought to be sorry for myself, going to be boiled alive any minute now." At last all the potatoes were in the pot, and only Mrs Pepperpot was left. But by now she was so covered in earth that the mother didn't notice her. But the little boy did. He was peering into the bucket, and he put his small hand in and lifted Mrs Pepperpot out. "That's torn it," said Mrs Pepperpot, and shut her eyes. "What a funny little tato," said the little boy. "I keep it." And he ran off with her into the scullery, where he hid behind the door. The rest of the family were too taken up with getting the meal ready to notice where he'd went. Sitting on a box, the little boy held Mrs Pepperpot very carefully on his knee. "You my tato?" he asked. Mrs Pepperpot nodded. "That's right. I'm your tato." The little boy's eyes grew round with amazement. "You a talking tato?" he asked. "That's right," said Mrs Pepperpot again. "I'm a talking tato." "Can I eat you?" he asked, looking at her very closely. Mrs Pepperpot shivered a bit, but she spoke very calmly. "I don't think I would if I were you, Sonny. I don't make very good eating." Just then his mother called him to eat his dinner, so he put Mrs Pepperpot down on the box and said, "I had dinner now. You my talking Tato. You stay here. I come back soon and play with you." "Well, Sonny," said Mrs. Pepperpot, "I may have to go, but I'll come back tomorrow, and then I'll bring you a present. How's that?" "You bring me another talking Tato?" he said, and then ran back to his mother, who was putting a great heap of mashed potato onto his plate. Mrs. Pepperpot wondered what she should do next. If she climbed back into the bucket and waited for a ride home, that might take hours before the boy went back to the field, and Mr. Pepperpot would be fretting about her. Just then there was a little scratching noise behind the box, and a mouse peeped out. "Hello," said Mrs. Pepperpot in mouse language. The mouse came out to look at her, and Mrs. Pepperpot had never seen such a skinny creature. "If you help me get out of here," she said, "I can have a nice piece of bacon at home you can have." The mouse pricked up its ears. "Bacon, did you say? We haven't seen bacon in this house for a very long time." "Why do you stay here if there's so little to eat?" asked Mrs. Pepperpot as she got on the mouse's back. "Well," said the mouse, starting off through a hole in the wall, "I've been with the family all my life, you know, so I don't like to leave them in the lurch. I mean, what would people say if they found out there wasn't enough food here to feed a mouse?" When they got to the foot of the hill leading to her house, Mrs. Pepperpot thanked the mouse and promised to put the piece of bacon behind the box in the scullery the next day. Then she very conveniently grew large and hurried home. Mr. Pepperpot was standing at the front door, anxiously peering out into the dark. "Where have you been all this time?" he asked. "Looking for my bucket of potatoes," said Mrs. Pepperpot. "Can't you see how grubby I am? Crawling on my hands and knees in the mud, I was. But I couldn't find it anywhere." Did the boy bring back the bucket? Did Mrs. Pepperpot have the children arrested? And what about that little boy's talking Tato? Well, all that is part of another story.